The needle caught the morning light like a sliver of captured sun, and Rose Dalton drove it through silk the color of new snow without ever once thinking about how that silk might have looked against her own skin. Millhaven, Texas, 1878. A town built from red dust and stubbornness, sitting at the edge of the Edwards Plateau where the land could not quite decide whether it wanted to be beautiful or brutal, and usually settled on being both at the same time. The main street ran long and flat, lined with wooden storefronts that baked pale in the summer heat, and at the very end of that street, where the buildings began to thin out toward open range, sat the small shop with the hand-painted sign above the door. The letters read, Rose Dalton Fine Sewing and Alterations. But everyone in Millhaven simply called it the dress shop, and every woman in town with a wedding on the horizon eventually found her way through that front door. Rose had turned 31 the previous April, and had accepted the birthday with the same quiet practicality she applied to everything else in her life. She was not a tall woman, but there was something about the way she carried herself, straight-spined, deliberate, unhurried, that made her seem larger than her frame suggested. Her hair was the deep reddish-brown of autumn oak leaves, and she kept it pinned up while she worked, though small curling strands were always escaping around her temples by midday. Her hands were her most remarkable feature. They were strong and sure, calloused at the fingertips from years of needlework, and they moved through fabric the way a pianist's hands moved across keys, with a confidence born of complete mastery. She had been a widow for 4 years. Thomas Dalton had been a good man. Rose said so without bitterness or performance whenever the subject arose, and she meant it plainly. He had been a cattleman's foreman, 20 miles out on the Hendricks spread, and he had died in the spring of 1874 when a storm-spooked longhorn had knocked him from his horse in the mud, and the horse had not seen him in time. It had been fast, at least. That was what people said, as though speed of dying was a gift. Rose had received the news on a Tuesday morning while she was hanging laundry, and she had finished hanging the laundry before she sat down and let herself understand it fully. That was simply the kind of woman she was. Thomas had left her the house, which was small but solid, and a modest sum from a year's back wages that the Hendricks operation paid out without being asked, because old Marcus Hendricks was a decent man who understood obligation. Rose had used that money to open the shop. She had always sewn. It was the thing she was best at, and she saw no practical reason to do anything other than what she was best at. She had been sewing wedding dresses for the women of Millhaven ever since, and in 4 years she had made 11 of them. 11 wedding dresses for 11 other women, and not one for herself. Nobody talked about it directly, because nobody talked about anything directly in Millhaven if they could help it. But there was an awareness of the situation that moved through the town's social fabric the same way the dress shop's kerosene lamp glowed through the window on winter evenings, noticed, warm, a little melancholy if you let yourself think on it too long. The women Rose sewed for always thanked her with real feeling, and most of them at some point looked at her with something complicated in their eyes that Rose always deflected with a practical comment about hemline adjustments or buttonhole spacing. She did not feel sorry for herself. That was important to understand. Rose Dalton was not a woman who sat in the shadows of her own life feeling tragic. She had her work, which genuinely absorbed her. She had her garden, where she grew tomatoes and herbs with the same exacting attention she brought to needlework. She had her friendship with Nora Hecht, who ran the mercantile with her husband Carl and whose opinions on every subject in Millhaven were as reliable as the noon cannon at Fort Concho. And she had the particular satisfaction of doing one thing extraordinarily well, which she had come to understand was more than most people ever managed. But there were evenings when the shop was locked and the lamp was low and she was turning out the last few stitches on some other woman's happiness when something pulled at her. Not grief exactly, not longing exactly. Something in between those two things, something without a clean name, something she had learned to set down the way you set down a heavy basket carefully, deliberately, and then walk away from it before it could claim your back entirely. It was on one of those evenings, in the first week of October 1878, that Orville Boone first came to Millhaven. He arrived the way most people arrived, on horseback, dusty from the road, coming up from the south where the stage road cut through the limestone breaks. But the way Orville Boone arrived was also distinct from most people, because he arrived leading a second horse that carried a pack of carpentry tools so carefully wrapped and secured that the care of it was visible even from a distance. And because he stopped his horse in the middle of the main street and sat there for a full minute looking at the town as though he was deciding something about it, not the other way around. He was 34 years old, lean in the particular way of men who work hard with their hands and forget to eat properly, with a face that had spent too much time in open weather and wore the evidence of it in the lines around his eyes. Those eyes were a color that changed depending on the light, sometimes gray, sometimes a pale greenish-brown, and they had an expression in them of careful attention, as though he was always listening to more than just the words being spoken. His hair was dark and ran a little long against the collar of his coat. He wore a good hat, plain wool, well kept. He was a carpenter by trade. He had been one since he was 15, when he apprenticed under a cabinet maker in San Antonio who had taught him that wood remembered everything done to it, and that therefore a craftsman had to think about what he was doing well before he did it. He had carried that philosophy into everything since. He had come to Millhaven because the town's growth had outpaced its construction, and word had reached him through a series of letters and passed-along messages that there was work here for a man who knew his way around timber and joinery. He had no particular attachment to any other place. He had been raised in Bixar County and had ranged wide since then, Laredo, San Angelo, briefly into New Mexico territory before a dry year convinced him to come back east. He had no wife. He had never been married, which at his age in that time and place was unusual enough that most people who learned it assumed there was a story attached, and they were not wrong, but it was not the kind of story he led with. He took a room at Millhaven's single boarding house, operated by a widow named Mrs. Eunice Platt, who served enormous breakfasts and maintained strong opinions about punctuality and mud on the front steps. He introduced himself to the town's general character over the following 3 days, meeting the men who had worked for him, Luther Crane, who wanted an extension built onto his hardware store, the new Methodist minister, Reverend Flood, who needed a proper floor laid in the church hall, and Jackson Fry, who operated the livery and had been meaning for 2 years to build a proper feed room. Orville assessed all 3 jobs with the measured gravity of a doctor examining patients, made his prices known, and began work the following Monday. He first saw Rose Dalton on that Saturday, the day before he started work, when he was walking the length of the main street in the early evening simply to know it better. The dress shop's window was lit. He could see through it the way you can see through a lit window when the outside is dark enough clearly, like a painting hung in a frame. A woman was seated at a work table, her back mostly to him, bent over fabric spread wide across the surface. Her hands moved in small, precise gestures. There was something in the scene that stopped him the way that good things sometimes stop you unexpectedly. A piece of music through an open window, the particular quality of late afternoon light on a familiar hillside. He stood there for a moment he could not entirely account for, and then he moved on, because a man standing in the dark outside a woman's window was not a thing he intended to be. He learned her name the next morning when Mrs. Platt served biscuits and gravy and explained the town's principal residents to him, the way a woman who has observed everything for 30 years explains a subject she knows well. Rose Dalton, widow, runs the dress shop at the end of the main street. Sews the most beautiful wedding dresses you ever saw. Been sewing them for every woman in town who's gotten married since she opened that shop 4 years back. Never made one for herself, though. Mrs. Platt said the last part in a tone that held no judgment, just acknowledgement, the way you'd acknowledge the weather. Orville ate his biscuits and filed the information away without knowing why it seemed important enough to file. He met Rose properly, as was perhaps inevitable, through the fabric of shared community. Millhaven was small enough that any two people in it would cross paths within a fortnight if they were both active in the town's daily life. The occasion was Nora Heck's Mercantile, where Rose came on a Tuesday morning to purchase new thread in 3 different weights and a supply of bone buttons, and where Orville had come to buy chalk lines and a broad chisel. Nora Heck, who recognized opportunity when it walked through her door in pairs, introduced them with the smooth efficiency of a woman who had been orchestrating exactly this kind of introduction for decades. Rose Dalton, this is Orville Boone. He's the carpenter I told you about who's going to do Luther Crane's extension. Mr. Boone, Rose is our finest, well, she's just our finest. Full stop. Nora said it and then moved immediately to the back of the store to check on something that clearly did not need checking, leaving them standing across from each other in the small space between the notions cabinet and the tool rack. Rose looked at him directly, which was a habit she had, and which some people found disconcerting because it was so uncalculated. "You're the one who arrived Sunday and spent 20 minutes looking at the roof of the hardware store," she said. 17 minutes, Orville said. "The roof has a drainage problem that's going to cause real damage inside of 2 winters. I was deciding whether to bring it up to Luther before he hired me for the extension, or after." "Which did you decide?" "Before, he was annoyed. Then he hired me anyway and added the roof to the job." Something shifted in Rose's expression that was not quite a smile but was moving in that direction. "That sounds about right for Luther," she said. "He respects a man who tells him the truth even when the truth is inconvenient. I assume you're settling in well with Mrs. Platt's establishment. She makes excellent biscuits." "She does. She also charges extra if you come in past 9 in the evening, though she won't tell you that until after the first time you do it." "Good to know," Orville said. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. Rose began gathering her thread from the display shelf with the decisiveness of someone who knows exactly what she needs, and Orville found himself watching her hands again, the way they moved, the sureness of them. "I should get back," she said, not with coldness but with the simple fact of it. "I have a fitting this afternoon and the bodice isn't finished." "Of course," Orville said. "Good to meet you, Mrs. Dalton." She looked at him once more before she turned away, that same direct look, and said, "And you, Mr. Boone." Then she gathered her parcels from Nora, who appeared from the back with the perfect timing of someone who had been listening to every word, and went out the door into the October morning. Orville stood with his chisel in his hand and found himself thinking about her hands. The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that seem unremarkable from the outside, but are in fact the carefully laid foundation of something consequential. Millhaven was a place where people's paths crossed regularly at the post office, at the church, at the mercantile, at the well behind the main street where the water ran cold and sweet from deep limestone. Rose and Orville crossed paths in all of these places, and each crossing added something small but solid to the growing structure between them, the way a careful carpenter adds one measured plank at a time. He began to understand things about her by observation before he understood them by conversation. She walked quickly everywhere she went, as though there was always something waiting that deserved her full attention, but she also stopped completely and without impatience when someone needed to speak to her. She was the kind of person that Millhaven's older residents sought out not just for sewing work but for counsel, and she gave that counsel practically and without drama. When old Jacob Mendes, who farmed the creek bottom 2 miles east, came into the dress shop one afternoon in a state of agitation about a property dispute with his neighbor and sat down in the chair beside her work table uninvited, Rose set down her needle and listened to the whole thing, asked 4 or 5 precise questions, and told him which lawyer in Fredericksburg handled land matters most reliably, and also reminded him that he had a standing agreement with that neighbor about water rights that predated the current dispute and might be worth checking before anyone spent money on legal fees. Jacob went out looking calmer. Rose picked up her needle. She had not wasted a word or emotion. Orville thought about that for a long time. He also thought about what Mrs. Platt had said. He had not meant to think about it as much as he did. The detail of the wedding dresses had caught in his mind with an unexplained persistence, the image of a woman who spent her skilled hands making the dresses that launched other women into marriage, year after year, without ever making one for herself. There was something in that image that he could not fully name, but that moved him in a way he recognized as significant. He had learned to pay attention to the things that moved him. It had taken him a long time to learn that, and the learning had been costly, but he had learned it. He was working on Luther Crane's extension through most of October, and the work was satisfying in the straightforward way that competent work always was. He built true and square and took no shortcuts, and Luther Crane, who had seen enough poor workmanship to know the good kind, immediately watched Orville work with the satisfaction of a man who had made a right decision. The other men of Millhaven came around to watch as well, the way men do when there is skilled work being done, and among the things they talked about while they watched was the general character of the town, its residents, its history, its particular textures. It was from Hank Prescott, who ran the barber shop and who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of Millhaven's social history, that Orville learned the rest of it. About Thomas Dalton and the Longhorn and the Tuesday Morning, and how Rose had gone about building her life afterward with a steadiness that the town admired deeply and also found, in some private communal way, a little heartbreaking. "She never complains," Hank said, sitting on an upturned bucket that he had appropriated from Luther's supply pile. "Not once, not about anything. She just works, makes those beautiful dresses one after another. Clara Webb's dress last spring had this embroidered panel down the front that I swear looked like actual flowers, not stitching. People came from over in Lano just to see it before the wedding." Orville set a beam in place and ran his hand along the join to test its fit. "She does all her own embroidery. Everything. All by herself in that shop. I don't know how she manages the volume she does. She sews everyday clothes too, not just the fancy work. Half the town brings their mending to her." "Has she had no company since her husband?" Orville asked, and then immediately wished he had found a more natural way to ask it. Hank looked at him with the bright-eyed appreciation of a man who recognizes a worthwhile topic. "3 men have tried," he said. "She was kind to all of them and married none of them. Tom Birch proposed outright after about 6 months of calling, and she told him plain that she was grateful for his regard but that she wasn't ready, which was the truth, I think, at the time. Henderson Price came around the following year, and that lasted a little longer, maybe 4 months of Sunday afternoons, before she told him something similar. And Bill Eads just last year, who I personally think she liked somewhat better than the other two, but he wanted to move up to Abilene and she wasn't willing to leave her shop, and that was the end of that." Orville said nothing. He picked up his hammer and drove 4 nails with 4 clean strokes. "There's no defect in her," Hank said with sudden seriousness. "I want to be clear about that. There's nothing wrong or broken. She's been waiting for something particular, I think. Even if she doesn't know that's what she's doing." Orville looked at Hank for a moment and then looked back at his work. "A woman like that," he said, "you'd want to be sure before you approached her." "You'd want to be very sure," Hank agreed. The event that properly opened things between them was the Caldwell girl's dress. Louisa Caldwell was 22 and engaged to a young rancher named Pete Marsh, and she had commissioned her wedding dress from Rose 6 weeks out from the wedding, with such excitement that Rose had smiled genuinely for an hour after the girl left the shop. Louisa was the sort of person whose joy was contagious, unself-conscious, and complete, and it was impossible to be around her delight without feeling some of it. The dress was to be made from ivory silk that had been ordered from a dry goods supplier in Austin, and it was going to be Rose's most ambitious piece. Yet Louisa had brought a folded magazine page from a publication called Godey's Lady's Book, showing a design with a trained skirt and intricate lace insets at the sleeves and collar, and Rose had studied it for a long time before saying she could do it and meaning it completely. The problem came on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks before the wedding. Nora Hecht came to the dress shop at a near run, which was alarming because Nora Hecht never moved at a near run for anything, and she came in through the door without knocking, which she also never did. "The silk," Nora said. "The supply wagon from Austin. The driver got turned around in the flooding over by the creek crossing and lost 2 boxes off the back of the wagon. Rose, the silk is gone." Rose set down her needle. She sat very still for one moment, and the quality of that stillness was different from her usual stillness. There was something working in it, something rapid and interior. Then she said, "How much time before the wedding?" 22 days. "What silk does Pierce and Dunbar carry in Fredericksburg?" "I don't know exactly. Something surely. It would take 2 days to ride to Fredericksburg, purchase whatever's available, and ride back. That leaves 20 days to complete the dress." "Is that enough?" Rose was already calculating. "If I work from first light to 10 each night, yes. But I would need thread to match whatever silk Pierce and Dunbar carries, and I won't know that until I see the fabric. And I would need someone to ride to Fredericksburg, because I can't leave the shop. I have 3 other alterations due next week." It was at this point that the shop door opened again, because Orville Boone had been walking past on his way back from the church hall job and had seen Nora's entry and Rose's expression through the window and had, without precisely forming a plan, opened the door. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, aware of the conversation's privacy. "I didn't intend to interrupt. I saw the door was open." "You ride?" Rose said. Orville looked at her directly. "Yes." "Can you ride to Fredericksburg and back with a commission to purchase fabric?" He took exactly 1 second to consider the job he had pending at the livery, the time it would take, the weather. "Yes," he said. Rose stood up from her work table and went to the small desk in the corner where she kept her accounts. She wrote a short letter on a piece of paper with a careful hand, describing the silk she needed, the weight, the color, the acceptable alternatives in descending order of preference, and what price she was willing to pay. She included a bank draft drawn on her account at the Millhaven Bank, which she kept current and meticulously balanced. She folded the letter into an envelope and sealed it and wrote on the outside, "For the attention of Pierce and Dunbar Dry Goods, Fredericksburg, Texas." And then she handed it to Orville. He took the envelope and looked at her. "I'll leave in the morning," he said, "early." "I'll pay you for your time," she said. "You won't," Orville said, not curtly but finally. It was the tone of a man making a simple statement about what was true. "Tell me, is there anything particular about the weight or the weave that I should look for beyond what you've written?" Rose studied him for a moment. Then she said, "The letter is thorough, but if you're standing at the counter and they show you 2 options that seem equal, run your thumb across the surface. The one that feels like cool water is the right choice. The one that feels like nothing in particular is cheaper quality and won't take my needle the same way." Orville looked down at his thumb, then back at her. "Cool water," he said. "Yes." He left the next morning before 5, before Millhaven was fully awake, on his own gray horse that he had named nothing particular but which he sometimes called Gray in moments of carelessness. He made Fredericksburg in good time along the stage road through the hills, arrived before noon, found Pierce and Dunbar's establishment on the main street, presented his letter, and stood at the fabric counter while 2 very interested employees showed him silk options. He ran his thumb across 3 different pieces before he found the one that felt like cool water and asked the employee behind the counter to cut what the letter specified. He paid with the bank draft and had the fabric wrapped carefully in brown paper, and then in oilcloth against the possibility of rain. And he rode back to Millhaven through the late afternoon and into the early evening, and arrived at the dress shop just as Rose was locking the front door. She opened the door again when she saw him, and he brought the wrapped package inside and set it on the work table, and she unwrapped it with hands that were entirely steady, and when the silk lay in the lamplight she passed her palm across it once and then looked up at him. "This is exactly right," she said, and there was something in her voice that was different from her usual practical tone, something warmer. "This is exactly what I needed. How did you know which one?" "I ran my thumb across 3 of them," he said simply. Rose looked at him for a long moment, and in the lamplight her face was unguarded in a way it rarely was in daylight, in the busy moving around of the town's daily life. She looked at the silk and then at him and then at the silk again, and then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Boone, genuinely." "Orville," he said. She paused. "Orville," she said, testing it and then apparently finding it acceptable. "Rose," she offered in return. "I know," he said, and then they both understood something had shifted slightly in the space between them, and they both held that understanding quietly for a moment before Rose said she had 22 days' worth of work to begin immediately, and Orville said he understood and good evening, and left. He walked back to Mrs. Platt's in the dark and did not think about anything in particular except that he was glad he had gone. The 22 days before Louisa Caldwell's wedding were remarkable ones for Millhaven, though most people did not know it. Rose worked exactly as she had calculated, first light to 10 each night, and she worked with a focused ferocity that those who knew her recognized as the full engagement of her particular genius. She slept briefly and ate sensibly, and did not waste a moment. But she also, in those 22 days, had 7 conversations with Orville Boone of varying length and significance, and each one built onto the last like careful joinery. The first was brief, a day after his return, when he stopped by to ask how the silk was working, and she showed him 2 completed panels of the skirt and explained the structural challenge of the train's construction, and he listened with the same attentiveness she had initially noticed at Nora's, and then asked a question about the underlying support structure. That was so precisely the right question that she looked at him with new attention. He had, it turned out, a carpenter's understanding of how things needed to be built from the inside out in order to hold their shape under the weight of use. The principle applied to dresses as much as to houses, and his intuition about it was accurate. The second conversation happened when she came out at midday to sit on the step of the shop door and eat the simple lunch. She always brought bread and hard cheese and an apple, and he was passing by and she asked him to sit, which surprised them both. He sat on the step below hers and ate a biscuit from his own pocket, and they talked about Millhaven, about what he had found in it, about what she had built in it. She told him about Thomas, directly and without drama, the way she always did, because she had learned that the telling of it clearly was easier on everyone than the delicate circling around it. He listened and did not perform sympathy, which she was grateful for, and then he said simply that Thomas sounded like a good man and that she had done something remarkable with what came after, and the simplicity of that was so much better than the usual elaborate consolations people offered that she did not know quite what to do with it. She said, "What brought you west? Originally, I mean." He considered this. "I grew up in San Antonio. It's as west as I've ever known. The range and the sky out here feels like something I was always supposed to see." He paused. "I had a wife," he said, and his voice changed slightly on the word, not with grief, but with a careful honesty that she recognized as the tone of truth being told without flinching. "Her name was Clara. We were married in 1870 in San Antonio. She died of typhoid fever in the summer of 1872. We had no children." Rose said, "I'm sorry." "Yes," he said, not dismissively but accepting it fully. "It took me a long time to settle after that. I moved around a good deal. San Angelo, Laredo, across the border for a while into Chihuahua, where the work was different and the language was useful to learn. I came back north eventually. I always come back north." "Why?" He thought about it. "I think because I'm not actually a man who prefers to be without a home. I just spent some time convincing myself I was." Rose turned the apple in her hands. "And now you're here," she said. "And now I'm here," he agreed, and something in the way he said it was not only about Millhaven. The third, fourth, and fifth conversations happened in a compressed period on a weekend when Millhaven held its fall social, a thing of potluck food and fiddle music in the church hall that marked the end of the harvest season. Rose went because not going was not something she did. She was woven into the community of Millhaven too thoroughly to stand apart from its gathering points. Orville went because Reverend Flood had invited him directly as thanks for the good work done on the church hall floor. They found themselves adjacent at the food table, and then again near the wall where the chairs were set when the fiddle started, and the dancing began. They watched the dancers rather than dancing themselves, which suited them both. Rose because she had not danced in 4 years and was uncertain about the return to it. Orville because he had never been a particularly accomplished dancer and knew it. They talked through the evening in the way that people talk when they are beside each other for a long time, and the surrounding noise gives their words a comfortable privacy. He told her about his time in Chihuahua, the adobe buildings, the different approach to wood and metal that the craftsmen there used, the things he had learned. She told him about the first wedding dress she had ever made before she married Thomas, for a cousin in San Marcos who had been too poor to buy one and who had come to her in desperation, and how Rose had sat up 4 nights in a row to finish it in time, and how the cousin had cried when she put it on, and how that was the moment Rose had understood what her hands were actually for. "Do you love it?" he asked. "The work itself?" "More than almost anything," she said, and she meant it without qualification. "That's a rare thing," he said, "to do work that you love and that is genuinely useful to people. What about you?" He looked at his hands, at the work-roughened fingers. "Yes," he said, "yes. There is something in wood that responds to being handled well. You can feel it. I know that sounds—" "No," Rose said. "It doesn't sound strange at all." She looked at her own hands. "Silk is the same. You can feel when you are handling it properly and when you're not." They were both quiet for a moment, and the fiddle played, and around them Millhaven danced and ate and laughed. The sixth conversation was harder and happened on a gray afternoon when Rose had come out to the well for water, and Orville was coming back from the church hall with his toolbox, and they met in the side alley behind the main street. It was harder because something in the sequence of what had come before had built a kind of pressure between them that was honest, and neither of them was particularly interested in ignoring it, and they had to decide, standing there in the gray light with the well rope between them, whether they were going to acknowledge it or continue to move carefully around it. Rose drew her water first. Then she set the bucket down and looked at him. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "I have been careful for a long time," she said, "about this kind of thing, about letting something happen, and I think I have been careful for good reasons, but I also think that careful can become a habit that outlasts its reasons." Orville set his toolbox down on the ground. "Yes," he said carefully. "I'm not saying anything precisely," Rose said. I think I want to say that I notice things about you. And I am not certain what to do with that noticing yet." She picked up her bucket. "I thought it was fair to tell you." He looked at her for a long moment. "I notice things too," he said. "I have been trying to work out the correct approach. I don't want to be wrong about this." "Wrong how?" "Wrong in the sense of presuming something that hasn't been offered." He met her eyes. "Wrong in the sense of rushing something that shouldn't be rushed." Rose studied him. "You're a careful man," she said, not as criticism. "I wasn't always," he said. "I've learned to be." She nodded once. She was not going to pretend that she did not understand what they were talking about, because pretending was not something she did. "Then let's both be careful," she said, "and also honest. Both things at once." He almost smiled. "That seems right," he said. The seventh conversation was shorter and happened through the window of the dress shop, where Rose was working late the night before Louisa Caldwell's wedding, and Orville was walking past and stopped because the light was on. He knocked on the glass. She looked up and he gestured, "Are you all right?" She held up the nearly finished dress, nearly done. He gave a small nod that said, "Good." She gave a small nod back. He moved on. But she was smiling when she looked back down at her needle, and she let herself feel it fully, because that too was something she had decided to try. Louisa Caldwell's wedding was a triumphant day. The dress was extraordinary. The ivory silk caught the light in the church in a way that made several people reach for their handkerchiefs before the ceremony had even properly started. And Louisa herself was so radiant and so perfectly fitted into the thing that Rose had built for her that Pete Marsh, standing at the altar, looked as though he could not quite believe his fortune. Rose sat in the pew 3 rows back and watched Louisa walk down the aisle and felt the familiar combination of feelings: pride in the work, genuine joy for the couple, and that quiet, nameless thing she had learned to set down. She set it down. And then she looked up and found Orville across the church, in a pew on the other side, looking at her. Not at Louisa, not at the ceremony. At her. And his expression was one she recognized because she had seen it in her own mirror in a way she had not in years, not performing anything, just feeling something, just looking. She looked back at him for a moment, clear and open, and then the music began and Louisa reached Pete, and the ceremony started, and Rose looked forward with the rest of the congregation. But something in her had shifted in a way that was irreversible, and she knew it. November came to Millhaven in a rush of cold air from the north that sent people reaching for their heavier coats and piling wood against the sides of their houses for the winter ahead. The cedar and live oak around the town's edges went from dull green to gold and then began their shedding, and the limestone hills in the distance took on a pewter color that was beautiful in a cold, serious way. Rose added a small iron stove to her shop's single room that she stoked each morning, and that kept the space warm enough to work in, though some mornings she began sewing with her fingers slightly stiff from the cold until the fire caught properly. She was working on a practical order in November, not wedding dresses, but warm winter clothing commissioned by several of Millhaven's families, and a new coat for Reverend Flood, who had been wearing the same patched wool thing for 4 years. It was less glamorous work than the wedding dresses, but she gave it the same attention, because that was how she did things. Orville finished Luther Crane's extension in early November and began the livery feed room for Jackson Fry, which was a larger project than it sounded, because Jackson wanted it done properly insulated, rodent-proofed, with ventilation built in to prevent grain mold. Orville spent a week designing the specifics before he drove a single nail, sketching dimensions on paper at his table in Mrs. Platt's boarding house in the evenings, holding the lamp close. He and Rose had dinner together for the first time in the second week of November, at a deliberate occasion rather than a shared bench at a social event. Nora Hecht had organized it, because Nora organized everything that needed organizing and was not in the least subtle about it. She had invited them both to Sunday dinner with herself and Carl, and the dinner had been excellent. A beef roast that Carl had been tending all morning, potatoes, early winter squash from the garden, and the conversation had been easy and ranging, and full of the kind of laughter that surfaces naturally when 4 people who like each other are warm and fed and comfortable. Afterward, Rose and Orville had walked back along the main street toward her shop and his boarding house, which were in the same direction, and they had walked slowly in the cold night air and talked in the way people talk when they are learning each other's depths. She told him about growing up in Uvalde, about her father who had been a surveyor, and who had given her the habit of measuring things before acting on them, about her mother who had taught her to sew, and who had the same precise, sure hands that Rose had inherited and used to entirely different ends. He told her about his apprenticeship in San Antonio, about the old cabinet maker, a German man named Wilhelm Steiner, who had survived the 1840 crossing and built himself a life in Texas with his hands and his patience, and who had told Orville repeatedly that the secret of good work was not talent but willingness, the willingness to take the time the work required. "He sounds like someone I'd have liked," Rose said. You would have, Orville agreed. He would have liked you too. He respected people who took their craft seriously. He paused. He also had very strong feelings about wasted material. He would have appreciated how you use every scrap of fabric. Rose raised her eyebrows. How do you know how I use my fabric scraps? He had the good grace to look slightly caught. I've walked past your shop on several occasions when the door was open, he said. I may have observed things. You were watching me work, she said, and there was no accusation in it, just a smile at the edge of the words. I was appreciating skilled work, he said with dignity. She laughed. It was a full laugh, unguarded, and it surprised her slightly because she hadn't laughed that way in a while. The sound of it surprised Orville too, and he looked at her with an expression that she would later think of as the moment she became completely certain. They reached the door of the dress shop and stopped. I should go in, she said. I have an early start tomorrow. You always have an early start, he said, which was true. Yes, she looked at him in the cold, clear darkness. Orville. Rose. Would you like to come for supper Friday? I cook. Not like Nora Hecht, nothing that elaborate, but I cook honestly. He didn't answer immediately. He held the pause in the way she had come to understand meant he was being intentional with his words. I would like that very much, he said. Good, she said. 7 o'clock. Good night, Rose. Good night, Orville. She went inside and locked the door and stood in the warm, lamplit room for a moment before she did anything else. Just standing there, feeling something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Something full and warm and slightly alarming in the way that good things can be alarming when you have been without them long enough to forget their weight. Friday's supper was at Rose's house, not the shop. The house that had been hers and Thomas's and was now thoroughly and quietly hers, small and well kept, and arranged with the same precision she brought to everything, but also warm in a way that extended beyond the fire in the hearth. She had made venison stew with vegetables from the end of her garden, and cornbread that came out of the Dutch oven golden and clean, and she had gotten a bottle of good wine from Carl Hecht at the Mercantile, a French Burgundy that was an extravagance she had not bothered justifying to herself. He arrived precisely at 7. He brought her 2 things, a small bunch of late-season marigolds from Mrs. Platt's kitchen garden, which he had asked permission to pick and which were slightly wind-battered but intensely golden, and a small jar of sourwood honey from a beekeeper near the church road that he had stopped to talk to that morning, and who had pressed the jar on him with the generosity of rural Texas. Rose put the marigolds in a jar of water on the table and the honey on the kitchen shelf, and told him to sit wherever he liked, and he sat in the chair closest to the fire with the ease of someone who is comfortable in spaces that are inhabited, not just occupied, and they ate and talked, and the evening opened up wide and easy and long. They talked about things that matter. Not just pleasantries, not the careful surface conversation of people who are still measuring each other's depths, but the real things, what they believed about work and about people, about fairness and its absence, about loss and what comes after. He told her about the injustice he had seen moving around Texas, the way land was taken from families who had held it in ways that no courthouse ever quite recorded properly, the way certain people's claims were heard over others, in ways that nobody with power wanted to examine too closely. She told him about the women she sewed for, the ones who came in for wedding dresses and whose faces held joy, but also the ones who came for mending work and whose faces held things they couldn't say directly, and how she had learned to listen to fabric sometimes as much as to words, because what people needed from their clothing told you what they were carrying. You see people very clearly, he said. I've had a lot of time to look, she said. It's more than time, he said. Some people spend their whole lives looking and see nothing that isn't about themselves. She considered this. You see people clearly too, she said. I've watched you with Luther, with Jackson Fry, with Reverend Flood. You hear what they need before they say it. Builder's habit, he said. You learn to listen for what someone really wants the house to do before you build it, because people know what they want to feel but not always what they want to build. That's very true of dresses too, Rose said. She poured a small amount more of the wine. Tell me, do you intend to stay in Millhaven after the current work is done? He met her eyes. That depends on several things, he said. She did not look away. What things? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I have been traveling a long time. I have been telling myself I'm a man who travels, who moves, who doesn't stay. I believed it for a while, but I've been here 2 months and I feel— He stopped. He tried again. I feel like I'm in the right place, and I don't think it's only the place. Rose sat with that. The fire crackled. Outside, Millhaven was dark and quiet under a clear November sky. I am very careful about things, she said. I have been very careful for very good reasons. I want you to know that the care is not about you. The care it's something I built after Thomas, to protect myself. And I think it has served me, and I also think it may be time to be careful in a different way. He was listening to every word the way he always listened. What I mean, Rose said, is that I want you to know I am not closed. I was closed, I think, for a while, and I'm not certain I'm fully open yet, but I am opening. She looked at the marigolds in their jar, the intense golden yellow of them. Is that a comprehensible thing to say? It's the most comprehensible thing you've said, Orville said quietly. And for what it's worth, I am not in a hurry. I know how to take the time something requires. Rose smiled then, a real smile, full and clear. Wilhelm Steiner's philosophy applied to more than woodwork, she said. He was a wise man, Orville agreed. He left at 9:30, which was the proper time to leave, and when he said good night at the door, he took her hand, not dramatically, not performatively, just took it briefly, the way you hold something you want to be careful with, and then let it go, and walked back down the path to the road. Rose closed the door and stood in her quiet house and understood that she had been right. The opening was real, and it was happening, and she was not afraid of it. December brought the full winter to Millhaven, and with it, the shorter days and longer evenings that are, in their way, a gift to people who have things to figure out about each other. Rose and Orville saw each other 3 or 4 times a week by this point, at church, at Nora's, on the occasional evening walks they had taken to, wrapped in their winter coats, moving through the cold, quiet streets of the town and talking as they went. They had fallen into a rhythm that felt natural and earned and honest, and the town of Millhaven, which was watching with the benevolent attention of a community that genuinely liked both of them, was quietly, collectively, very pleased. Rose was working in December on 2 projects simultaneously: a set of winter dresses for the Caldwell family's younger daughters, and what she privately thought of as her most challenging commission yet. Margaret Birch, old Tom Birch's widowed mother, now 70 and with better eyes than most people half her age, wanted a good dress for her oldest granddaughter Clara's wedding in late January. Clara Birch was marrying a young man from Fredericksburg named Samuel Adler, who had come into the territory the previous year, and who ran a small surveying operation that was well regarded by the county. The dress Margaret Birch had in mind was in a deep blue-gray silk that the old woman had been holding in a chest for 20 years, waiting for the right use. The silk was extraordinary. It was French, bought by Margaret's late husband at a substantial price from a trading company in New Orleans in 1858, and it had been wrapped in muslin and kept in camphor all this time, and was as perfect as the day it was bought. When Margaret brought it to the shop and Rose unfolded it on the work table, both women stood silent for a moment in the face of it. "It deserves something worthy," Margaret said. "I'll make sure it gets it," Rose said. She was working on the pattern for the Birch dress one December evening when Orville knocked on the shop door. She unlocked it and let him in, and returned immediately to the table where the pattern pieces were laid out, because she was in the middle of a calculation she didn't want to lose. He came and stood beside the table and looked at the blue-gray silk, which was draped at one side in the lamplight. "This is Margaret Birch's piece," he said. He had heard about it at the church, where it had been discussed with the reverence the town reserved for things of genuine quality. "Yes, Clara's wedding dress." Rose moved a paper pattern piece slightly, adjusted its angle, measured with her tape. Orville stood beside her and looked at the silk and then, very quietly, said something that caught her in the chest. "Have you ever thought," he said, "about making one for yourself?" She went still, not the working stillness but a different kind. She set her tape down on the table without making any noise with it. "People have asked me that," she said carefully. "It comes up. I imagine it does." He was looking at the silk, not at her. "I'm not asking in the way people ask it when they're being curious or pitying. I'm asking because—" He stopped. He turned and looked at her. "I'm asking because I want to know, genuinely." Rose looked at him. In the lamplight his face was very clear and the expression on it was the one she had come to trust above almost anything else she knew about him, direct, honest, without performance. "There were times," she said slowly, "when I thought about it. Right after I opened the shop, before the grief had settled into something more manageable. I would sometimes finish a dress for someone else and think, there's enough fabric left. I could cut something for myself. And I never did. I always found a reason not to." "What was the real reason?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think," she said, "that a wedding dress is a particular kind of thing. It's not just a dress. It points towards something, and for a long time I did not have anything it could point toward, and making it anyway would have felt hollow." He nodded slowly. "And I also think," she said, "that I got very comfortable with making them for other people. There's safety in being useful, in being necessary to someone else's joy without being responsible for your own." The word responsible hung in the warm air of the shop. Rose looked at her own hands on the table. "Does that make sense?" she said. "Perfect sense," he said. He picked up the end of the blue-gray silk and held it toward the lamp, and the light came through it in a wave of color that was both serious and beautiful. "This would suit you," he said. She looked up at him sharply, but his face held no guile. "Margaret Birch's granddaughter's wedding dress," she said. "Not this piece," he said, "but this color, this quality." He set the silk down gently. "You know exactly what I mean." She did know. She stood across the worktable from him in the lamplight, and she knew, and she felt something that was neither fear nor its absence but something entirely new, a readiness, a kind of spacious feeling in her chest, like a window opening onto a view she had known was there but hadn't quite looked at directly. "Orville," she said. "Rose, are you saying something specific?" She asked because she was Rose Dalton and she did not circle around the centers of things when she could go directly to them. He came around the end of the table slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back or redirect, but she did not step back or redirect. He stopped in front of her and he said, "I'm saying that I came to Millhaven not knowing what I was looking for, and I found something, and the something is you. And I'm not saying this because I've been alone too long, or because you're the most available woman, or because any of the reasons a man might have that are not good enough reasons. I'm saying it because you are because you are the person in this world who makes the most sense to me, and I can't think of a better reason than that." Rose looked at him for a long moment. "That is an entirely sensible reason," she said. "I thought you'd appreciate that," he said, and there was warmth in his voice now, that particular warmth he rarely showed to anyone but was entirely natural between them. "I am 31 years old," Rose said. "I have been a widow for 4 years. I have a business that I love and a house that is mine, and a life that is full enough that I never feel the lack of it in the daylight hours. I know all of this," he said. "But in the evenings," she said, and her voice changed slightly, "in the evenings when the work is done and the lamp is low and I'm finishing some other woman's happiness, I feel something. I've always felt something. And I have been setting it down every night for 4 years and walking away from it because that was what I decided to do." She stopped. "I don't want to keep setting it down." He reached out and took her hand. Both hands, actually, in both of his, the way a person holds something they mean to keep. His hands were warm and rough and entirely steady. "Then don't," he said. She looked at their joined hands, the carpenter's hands and the seamstress's hands, the two kinds of precision, the two kinds of care. "You'd need to ask me properly," she said, "at the proper time. I'm not going to pretend that's happening in the middle of my workroom over a pattern spread out on the table." He laughed, and the laugh was genuine and free, and she thought she had never heard quite that sound from him before and that she wanted to hear it many more times. "Understood," he said. "Good," she said. She squeezed his hands and then released them and stepped back to the table and picked up her tape measure. "Now I need to finish this pattern before the light gets worse." "You're welcome to sit." He sat in the chair beside the window and watched her work, and she worked steadily and precisely, and with the particular pleasure of a person who is both happy and absorbed in a task. And the shop was warm and the lamp was bright, and outside the December wind moved through Millhaven's dark streets without touching any of it. January came in cold and crystalline, the sky a hard blue above the pale hills, the ground frozen at night and thawing to mud by noon. Rose finished Clara Birch's wedding dress in the second week of January, and it was magnificent. The blue-gray silk worked into a gown that had a severity and an elegance that perfectly suited Clara, who was a serious and beautiful young woman who would have looked absurd in ruffles and flounces. Margaret Birch came for the final fitting with her granddaughter and stood back and watched Clara stand in the dress and pressed both hands flat against her cheeks and did not say anything for a full minute. Then she said, "Rose Dalton, you are a wonder of this world." Rose said, "The silk did most of the work, I just didn't get in its way." Which was exactly the kind of thing Rose said about her best work, and which everyone who heard it understood was the highest form of compliment the thing could receive. Clara Birch's wedding to Samuel Adler was planned for the last Saturday in January. It was a cold, sparkling day, the sky a flawless hard blue, the air sharp enough to make breathing feel like swallowing something clean and new. The church was full with nearly everyone in Millhaven, which was usual for weddings and for events that the town recognized as significant. Rose sat in her customary place 3 rows back and watched Clara Birch walk down the aisle in the blue-gray silk and felt the familiar combination, the pride and the joy, and the quiet thing she had been learning to feel differently. Orville was beside her. He had asked her, quietly, in the days leading up to the wedding, whether she would sit with him, and she had said yes simply, and so they sat together in the pew and watched the wedding and afterward walked out into the cold afternoon with the rest of the congregation, and stood in the churchyard, while photographs were being attempted with a photographer's camera brought over from Fredericksburg for the occasion. During the reception dinner in the church hall, while the tables were full and the voices were loud and the fiddle player was warming up in the corner, Orville touched Rose's elbow and said, "Come outside for a moment." She looked at him. His face was settled and certain in a way she recognized. "Now," she said. "Yes." She put her shawl around her shoulders and followed him out the side door of the church hall into the churchyard, where the afternoon was settling toward evening, the blue sky deepening at its edges, the frost-whitened grass catching the last low light. They stood among the old cedar trees at the edge of the yard, away from the noise and the warm window light spilling from the hall. He turned to face her. He had put his hat in his hand, which was a gesture that cost him something in the January cold, but he did it properly, the way a man does a thing he has thought through. "Rose Dalton," he said, "I have been a man who didn't stay. I have been a man who kept moving, and I am asking you to be the reason I stay. Not just in Millhaven, but in the particular life that I want to build, that we would build together." He paused. "I know you have built something that is yours. I know your shop and your work and your independence are real and important. I'm not asking you to give any of that up. I'm asking you to let me stand beside you." He looked at her steadily in the cold evening light. "Will you marry me, Rose?" She looked at him for a moment. The cedar trees moved slightly in the cold air. Somewhere inside the church hall the fiddle started up. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Orville, I will." He put his hat back on his head and took her hands and pulled her close, and she let herself be pulled, and he kissed her in the cold churchyard air with the last of the January sun on them, and it was the kind of kiss that did not need anything added to it or said about it afterward. It was entirely sufficient, entirely itself. When they went back inside, Nora Hecht took one look at them and said, "Well, finally, with the satisfaction of a woman who has been patient for 3 months and considers the patience justified. Carl Hecht shook Orville's hand with genuine warmth. Reverend Flood, who was beside the punch bowl, turned around at the sound of Nora's exclamation and looked between them and said, "Shall I expect you both in my study next week?" Then, which was the most useful thing a minister could say in the circumstances. The news moved through the church hall in the way news moves through a small community that is genuinely invested, quickly, warmly, with the particular quality of people who are pleased for two people they actually know and like. Even old Margaret Birch, sitting at the head table with the just-married Clara, looked across the room with eyes that were bright, and not only because of her granddaughter's wedding day. Rose stood in the middle of it and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for 4 years. Not the loss of Thomas, which she had settled long ago, but the other thing, the nameless evening thing, the thing she had set down so many nights and walked away from. It was not set down anymore. It was held, and it was light, and it was right. The next weeks were full in a way that Rose had not expected. The engagement was a known fact in Millhaven by the Monday morning after the Birch wedding, and the response was generous and warm and occasionally overwhelming. Women who had been Rose's brides over the years stopped by the shop to express their happiness. Mrs. Platt cried, which surprised Orville considerably and moved him more than he admitted. Reverend Flood scheduled them in for their meetings with the calm efficiency of a man who took marriage preparation seriously. And then there was the question of the dress. Nora raised it first, as Nora always raised everything first. She came to the shop on a Tuesday morning 3 days after the engagement and sat in the chair by the window and said, without preamble, "What are you going to wear?" Rose looked up from the coat she was finishing for old Jacob Mendes. "I haven't thought about it yet." Nora looked at her with an expression that said she did not believe this even slightly. "I have a little time," Rose said. "Rose, you make wedding dresses. You are the wedding dress authority in this entire county and possibly several surrounding counties. What are you going to wear to your own wedding?" Rose put her needle down. "I'll make something," she said. "Of course you'll make something, but when? You have orders through March already." "I'll find time." Nora leaned forward. "Rose Dalton, you have sewn 11 wedding dresses for 11 other women and never once made one for yourself. You are finally making yourself one. You will set everything else aside for it if necessary, and I will help you explain that to your clients, who will all understand completely because they are human beings who have hearts." Rose looked at her friend for a moment. Then she said, "I don't know what I want," which was not something Rose Dalton said about anything ever, and they both knew it. "Well," Nora said more gently, "then let's figure it out." They spent 2 hours that afternoon talking about it, which was 2 hours Rose had not planned to spend that way, but which she did not regret. She brought out her books, the fashion plates from Godey's Lady's Book that she kept for reference, and she and Nora went through them with the seriousness of women who know that this matters, not for vanity's sake, but for its own sake. Rose had spent 4 years making wedding dresses that were perfect expressions of other women's particular spirits. Her dress needed to be a perfect expression of her own. It came to her on the 3rd day, not while she was looking at fashion plates, but while she was working on Mendy's coat, her hands moving automatically through familiar stitches while her mind ran in its own direction. She set the coat down and went to the fabric chest at the back of the shop and opened it. She had been saving fabric for years. Not intentionally, not with a plan, but a seamstress accumulates beautiful things the way a garden accumulates stones, naturally, because quality presents itself and you recognize it. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in clean muslin, was a length of deep ivory wool-silk blend that she had received as partial payment 2 years earlier from a woman passing through Millhaven who hadn't the cash for a full alteration, but had offered the fabric from her own trunk. Rose had wrapped it carefully and put it at the bottom and not thought too carefully about why she had kept it instead of selling it. She unwrapped it now and held it up in the January light coming through the shop window. It was warm-toned and rich and had a weight and drape that was entirely different from the cool light silk she had used for most of her bridal work, less romantic in the conventional sense, more serious, more enduring. It looked like something built to last. She held it against herself in front of the small mirror she kept on the shop wall for client fittings. She stood there for a long time. Then she went to her pattern drawer and pulled out a blank sheet of paper and began to draw. The dress she designed for herself was unlike any of the 11 that had come before it. It was simpler in its structure. She had no interest in trains or elaborate construction for her own sake. But the simplicity was the kind that requires more skill, not less, because there was nothing to hide behind. The cut was clean and precise, with a fitted bodice that worked with the fabric's particular drape, and sleeves that came to the wrist in the way she preferred for practical reasons, and which also happened to suit her. The only ornamental element was the embroidery she planned along the neckline and cuffs, small wildflowers worked in cream and gold thread. Marigolds because she could not quite get his marigolds out of her mind, and honeybees because of the honey he had brought, and because she liked the idea of the bee, which does useful work and is not bothered about whether anyone is watching. She worked on it in the early mornings and late evenings, around her other orders. She worked on it with a different quality of attention from anything else she had ever made, not more careful. She was always careful, but more present. She was thinking about what she was building toward. She was building toward her own life, the next chapter of it, and the dress was the first stitch in that chapter, and she made every stitch count. Orville knew she was making it. She had told him plainly, and he had received the information with the same attentiveness he brought to everything she said. One evening in early February he had asked if he could see it, not the finished thing, just the progress, and she had thought about it and then said yes, and showed him the bodice pinned on her dressmaker's form in the corner of the shop. He had looked at it for a long time without speaking, and then he said, "The embroidery on the cuffs," and she looked where he was looking, at the small marigold she had placed near the left cuff's edge, and she said nothing because there was nothing to say about it that adding words would improve. He had looked at her with something in his face that had no name but was entirely clear, and she had looked back at him with the same clarity, and then she said, "I still have 30 hours of work on it," and he said, "Then I'll leave you to it," and kissed her temple on his way out of the shop, which was something they had arrived at in the natural way of things, and which she found she wanted to feel every day. Meanwhile, Orville was building something too. He had spoken to Rose about his plans because that was how they operated, in consultation, in honesty. And she had listened carefully, and then said that the plans were good ones, and that she thought they should discuss the practical matters thoroughly before the wedding rather than after, which was entirely sensible, and was one of the many things he loved about her. She loved the word love now that she was applying it internally, turning it over, finding it fit. Orville had been looking at a piece of property at the southern edge of Millhaven, a half-acre lot with a good well and a stand of live oak trees, currently empty except for the grass and one leaning fence post. The owner was a man in San Antonio who had bought it speculatively years ago and was happy to sell. Orville had the savings for it, built up over years of good work and careful habits, and he planned to build a house on it that was large enough for a family and small enough to be warm and manageable, with a good workshop space for himself adjacent to it and enough room that Rose's shop could remain her shop. He was not, under any circumstances, asking her to give up her own space. He showed her the lot on a clear February afternoon, and she walked its perimeter and looked at the well and stood under the live oaks and turned her face up through the bare branches at the pale winter sky. "The location is good," she said. "The trees will give shade in summer, and the ground looks—" She crouched and picked up a handful of soil, examined it, let it fall. "The ground is solid." "I thought so," he said. "Build it to last," she said. "I expect to be there a long time." He took her hand. "So do I," he said. They set the wedding date for the 10th of March, 1879. It was Reverend Flood who suggested March spring was coming by then, the winter grip releasing, the air warming day by day, and both Rose and Orville had looked at each other and agreed that March was right. The weeks leading up to March 10th were full of the practical business of two people combining their lives, and Rose and Orville approached the business with the same honest pragmatism they brought to everything else. There were conversations about money. Both of them were plain and clear about their finances, which Orville thought was the most sensible thing a couple could be and which Rose had insisted on from the beginning. There were conversations about the house, about the workshop, about how her shop hours would remain hers to set. There were conversations about the future in the broader sense, about what they both wanted, and these conversations were the most important ones and also the most natural, because by this point they knew each other well enough that the conversations were largely confirmations of things already understood between them. Rose finished her wedding dress on the 4th of March, 6 days before the wedding. She worked the final stitches on the second marigold cuff embroidery in the quiet of a late evening, tied off the thread, clipped it close, held the dress up against the lamplight and turned it slowly. Then she put it on the dressmaker's form in the corner of the shop and stepped back and looked at it. It was, she thought without false modesty, the best thing she had ever made. Not the most elaborate, not the most technically complex, but the most true. Every stitch of it was exactly what it needed to be and nothing more, and the whole thing together said something she had been meaning to say for a long time. She stood there in the lamp-warm shop and looked at the dress she had finally made for herself, and she felt something that started in her chest and moved through her whole body, something that felt like arrival, like a place she had been traveling toward for a very long time finally appearing on the horizon as a real and certain destination. She thought about the 11 dresses that had come before it. She thought about the women who had worn them, Clara Webb and Louisa Caldwell, and young Clara Birch in her blue-gray silk and the others, 8 more, each one a story, each one a life that had changed shape in Rose's shop before walking down an aisle. She had given her best to all of them, and she did not regret a stitch of it, and she also understood now that the giving had been preparing her for something, the long, patient practice of it, the learning to build happiness carefully and precisely for someone else, until she understood it well enough to build it for herself. The morning of March 10th, 1879, was the kind of morning that seems designed for beginnings. The air was warm for March, carrying the green-tinged smell of things starting to grow, and the sky was the clear, generous blue of a Texas spring day that intends to be beautiful about it. Rose's friend Nora came early to the house to help her dress, and Nora, who had helped Rose button the backs of 11 other women's wedding dresses, was barely holding herself together with the effort of not crying before they had even left the house. "You are going to walk into that church," Rose said firmly, adjusting the cuff of her left sleeve, the marigold embroidery precise and perfect under her finger, "and you are going to compose yourself before the ceremony starts." "I will compose myself," Nora said, in a voice that suggested the composing would be effortful. Good. The dress was as Rose had envisioned it. In the morning light, rather than lamplight, it was warmer than she had expected. The wool-silk blend took the early sun and held it, and the ivory of the fabric was not cold white, but a warm, living color that suited her particular darkness of hair and eyes in a way that she had calculated correctly. Nora looked at her and said nothing for a moment, and then said everything with a single look. "Right," Rose said. "Let's go." Orville was at the church when she arrived, standing at the altar with Carl Hecht beside him as best man, and when he saw her come through the door of the church in her dress, with the morning light behind her, something moved across his face that had no name but was entirely visible, a kind of completeness. A man arriving at the place he had been working toward without knowing it, looking at the thing he intended to keep. Rose walked the aisle on her own 2 feet, which she had decided was right. She had no father present. Her father had died in 1875. Her mother lived in Uvalde with her sister and could not make the journey in her health, and Rose had written her a long letter that her mother would receive in a week and cry over in the best possible way. She walked the aisle on her own because she had built her life on her own and she was not about to pretend otherwise, and also because the only person she was walking toward was at the end of it and he was the destination, which was direction enough. She reached him. He took her hands. His hands were warm and steady. "Hello," he said quietly, because they were themselves even here, even now. "Hello," she said. Reverend Flood began, and Millhaven's church was full to its walls with everyone who had come to see this, the whole town, it seemed. The people who had brought their mending to her shop for years, and the ones whose daughters wore her work, and the ones who had watched both of them separately and had quietly hoped for exactly this. They were all there, and the feeling in the room was one of those collective feelings that a community generates when it is happy about something in the deep, real way, when two of its people are doing the thing they are supposed to do. The vows were the traditional ones from the Book of Common Prayer. Rose said them clearly with her eyes on Orville's, each word considered and meant. Orville said them in his measured, sure voice, and when he said them there was no doubt in any of them, not a syllable. The ring was a plain gold band. Orville had ordered it from a jeweler in Fredericksburg, and it was exactly right. Nothing fussy, honest, and intended to last. When he put it on her finger, she looked down at it for a moment, and then up at him, and the look was private in the way that things can be private even in a room full of people. Reverend Flood pronounced them married, and Orville kissed her there in front of all of Millhaven. And all of Millhaven responded with the warmth and the noise of people who have been waiting for something good and are now watching it. The reception was held in the church hall, which Nora and Margaret Birch and the other women of the community had decorated with green branches and early spring flowers gathered from along the creek. And there was food in tremendous quantity, and the fiddle player from Louisa Caldwell's wedding, who had apparently been following Rose's brides for years, and who played with the joyful energy of a man who enjoys his work. There was dancing, and Rose danced. For the first time in 4 years she danced, and she danced with Orville, who was not an accomplished dancer but who was determined, which turned out to be sufficient, and they danced through 2 songs and then retired laughing to the edge of the room where Carl Hecht handed them both glasses of the good wine he had ordered in especially. Carl said, "To the 2 of you," and raised his glass. Nora said, "Finally," which was the same thing she had said at the engagement moment and which she said now with equal satisfaction and somewhat less decorum. Orville looked at Rose. Rose looked at Orville. They touched their glasses together and drank. Later in the afternoon, while the party was still going and the fiddle was still singing and the hall was full and warm, Rose and Orville stood for a moment outside the side door of the church in the mild March air. The afternoon had kept its promise of beauty, the light softening now toward evening, the hills in the distance going from pale to gold. "Well," Rose said. "Well," Orville agreed. She took his arm, not because she needed the support, but because she wanted the contact, the solid reality of him beside her. He covered her hand with his, and they stood together in the afternoon and looked at Millhaven, the town she had built herself in, the town he had found, the town that was now theirs in the particular way that places become yours when your life is committed to them. "The house," she said. "It'll be ready by the end of April," he said. He had been working on it steadily through the engagement period, framing and roofing before the colder months, the interior work now progressing through the mild weather. "The kitchen is nearly finished, the workshop is framed, and the shop stays as it is," she said. "Of course," he said without hesitation. "I have a commission that's come in," she said. "Martha Ellison's daughter over in Lano. She wants a dress for a June wedding. They've asked me to make the journey to take measurements." "We'll go together," he said. "I've been meaning to look at some timber operations over that way," she smiled. "That's efficient." "I thought so." She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, just briefly, the way a woman does when she has decided that something good is allowed. He turned slightly and pressed his lips to her hair, just briefly, the way a man does when he has found what he was looking for and wants to acknowledge it quietly. They went back inside and danced one more time before the afternoon was done. The house was ready in late April, just as Orville had said. He built it true and square and solid, as he built everything, with deep window sills that caught the light and held it, and a porch along the front where the live oaks would give shade in summer, and a kitchen with good ventilation and a proper hearth, and a room that Rose immediately designated as her workspace for home sewing, with north-facing windows for the best consistent light. He built the workshop beside the house in the same good manner, and the smell of fresh-cut cedar hung around the property for weeks in a way that both of them found pleasant. Moving into the house was a Sunday project that the whole neighborhood participated in, because that was how Millhaven worked. When someone built something new, people came. They came with food and strong arms and opinions about furniture arrangement. And by the end of the day, Rose's belongings had been moved from the small house she had kept since Thomas and arranged in the new one, and Orville's considerably smaller collection of personal items were integrated with the ease of someone who has learned to travel light and knows that home is the people in a place, rather than the accumulation of objects. That evening, after everyone had gone and the house was quiet and theirs, Rose stood in the kitchen that was now their kitchen and made supper in a space that was new and entirely right. Orville sat at the kitchen table and watched her move through it, and the domestic normalcy of it, the ordinary miracle of two people being in their own home, was so exactly what both of them had wanted, and for so long not known how to want, that neither of them said much. They ate and cleaned up together and sat on the porch in the warm April evening and listened to the spring sounds of Millhaven settling toward night, the mockingbirds going through their entire repertoire in the live oaks, the distant sound of the creek running. "This is it," Rose said. He understood what she meant perfectly. "Yes," he said, "this is it." Summer came to Millhaven hot and golden and full, and Rose's shop stayed busy through it. The Llano Commission had gone well. The trip to Llano County in May, made together as planned, had been the first journey they had taken as a married couple, riding through the hills in the late spring warmth, and it had opened something about traveling that Rose had not expected. With Orville beside her, the road was different. Not easier exactly, but more complete, more interesting, a story that was being written rather than a necessity being endured. Martha Ellison's daughter's dress was another triumph deep rose silk, because the girl was named Violet Ellison and had a sense of humor about it, with embroidery along the bodice that Rose had designed to incorporate the bluebonnets that had been growing wild along the road when they made the measurements trip. Violet had cried at her fitting, and Rose had been entirely unmoved by the crying because she was used to it, and because she knew the crying was good. By August, Rose knew she was expecting a child. She sat with the knowledge for 3 days before she said anything, not from fear but from the particular private pleasure of knowing something before it became shared property. On the 4th day she told Orville at breakfast, directly and simply, the way she told him everything. He was very still for a moment, the way he was still when he was taking something in at its full size. Then he said, "Rose," and stopped. He tried again. "Are you well?" "Entirely," she said. "I feel very well." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I am—" He stopped again. He looked at her and his eyes were bright with something that was entirely unguarded and entirely honest. "I am so glad," he said. "Yes," she said, "so am I." The news moved through Millhaven with the speed and warmth of all good news, and the response was the same kind of generous communal happiness that had greeted the marriage, genuine, uncalculated, warm. Nora Hecht said, "Finally," again, which had by now become her traditional response to good events in Rose and Orville's lives, and Carl shook Orville's hand with real feeling, and Mrs. Platt, who had remained devoted to Orville as a former boarder, and to Rose as a citizen of the town she loved, sent over a covered dish of slow-cooked chicken that was so good it lasted 2 meals. Rose kept working through the pregnancy with modifications as they became necessary. The stool she began using at the work table, the earlier mornings that suited her new energy patterns, the occasional afternoon rest that she allowed herself with the same practical acceptance she brought to any logistical adjustment. Orville built her a better stool with a proper back support without being asked, and she accepted it without excessive thanks, but with a quality of attention that meant more than thanks. The baby was born in March of 1880, a month that Rose had begun to associate strongly with beginnings. He was a boy, solid and loud about it from the first minute, with a remarkable amount of dark hair and his father's expression of careful attention in miniature, peering at the world with the look of someone who has arrived somewhere interesting and intends to examine it thoroughly. They named him William Thomas Boone, for Orville's grandfather and for Rose's late husband. The naming was something they had discussed carefully, and Rose had been clear that she wanted Thomas honored, and Orville had agreed without hesitation. And it was the kind of moment that confirmed everything she already knew about who she had married. William Thomas was a vigorous baby who had no patience for boredom, and a great deal of patience for being carried, which suited Rose, who found that she could do a surprising amount of work with one hand, while the other held the baby in the crook of her arm. Orville took to fatherhood with the same thorough attention he brought to his craft, learning the specifics of William Thomas's particular needs and preferences with the same care he would have given to the particulars of a new building's requirements. He was up with the baby in the night with Rose, without being asked, without drama, simply because that was who he was. The dress shop continued. Rose sewed through the first year of motherhood in the rhythms that new motherhood allows, which were different from her old rhythms and required adjustment, but she adjusted. Millhaven's brides kept coming. The 12th wedding dress after her own was for Sophie Klein, whose family had come to the area the previous fall from a German settlement to the south. The 13th was for young Sarah Potts, whose mother had brought Rose mending since the shop opened, and who came in for her own commission with the expression of a woman who has been looking forward to something for a long time and is now watching it arrive. Each dress was different, each woman was different, and Rose's investment in the particularity of each was as complete as it had ever been. She did not love it less for having claimed her own happiness. If anything, she loved it more, because she understood more fully now what she was building toward when she sat at the work table and drove her needle through fine fabric in the morning light. Orville's work grew through those years. The Millhaven of 1880 was growing, more people coming through, more families settling, more buildings needed, which meant more work and more craft, and his reputation spread into the surrounding county as a man who built things that lasted and charged fairly for doing it. He took on a young man named Patrick Connolly as an apprentice in 1880, a 19-year-old from a farming family outside Fredericksburg who had quick hands and quicker eyes, and who sat at the workshop bench in the evenings learning joinery, with the same absorbed attention that Orville remembered from his own apprenticeship 40 years before, under Wilhelm Steiner, who had taught him that the secret of good work was willingness. He taught Patrick the same thing. Wood remembers everything done to it. Take the time the work requires, build true. Life settled into the shape of itself, which was a good shape, full and varied and grounded in the particular way that lives become grounded when they are committed to places and people. The house with the live oak trees held the 4 seasons through it in rotation, the white gold summers and the brief mild winters, and the extravagant Texas springs, and the clear crystalline falls, and each season added something to the accumulation of what they were building together. In the fall of 1881, Rose discovered she was expecting again. She told Orville at breakfast as she had before. His response was the same, the still moment, the reaching for her hand, the honesty of his expression. 2, he said. 2, she agreed. The second child was a daughter born in May of 1882 in the soft green warmth of a Texas spring morning. She was smaller than William Thomas had been and considerably quieter about her arrival, examining the world with a focused stillness that was immediately recognizable. They named her Mary Clara, for Orville's mother, and for the girl in the blue-gray silk dress whose wedding had begun everything that mattered. William Thomas, now 2 years old and very occupied with the business of being 2 years old, regarded his new sister with the expression of a child who has been told about something, and is now assessing whether the reality matches the description. He appeared to conclude that it mostly did, and settled in beside Orville on the bed where Rose was resting with Mary Clara, and looked at the baby with his father's careful attention, which made both his parents quietly certain he was going to be fine. The summer of 1882 was a full one. Rose's shop was busier than it had ever been. Word of her wedding dresses had now spread well beyond Millhaven, into Llano County and Mason County and as far as Fredericksburg, and women traveled to commission her work, which meant that her schedule was full months in advance. She managed it with the same deliberate efficiency she had always applied, and Orville managed the children with the same thoroughness he brought to everything, and they managed all of it together in the natural partnership of two people who have learned each other's rhythms and work with them rather than against them. On a September evening of that year, when the heat had broken and the air had the first edge of fall in it, they sat on the porch together in the way they did most evenings. William Thomas was in bed. Mary Clara was sleeping in the porch basket that Orville had built for exactly this purpose, lined with a soft blanket Rose had made from piece scraps of fine fabric, a remnant of ivory wool silk from her own wedding dress, a piece of Louisa Caldwell's silk, a corner of the blue-gray from Clara Birch's gown, a quilt of weddings. "I was thinking today," Rose said, "about when I started the shop." "What about it?" Orville said. "About how I never intended to only make wedding dresses. I thought I would make everything coats, children's clothes, everyday dresses, and I do, but the wedding dresses are the center of it. I never planned that." "Some things plan themselves," he said. She looked at him. "You sound like Hank Prescott." "Hank Prescott says wise things occasionally." "Occasionally." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the live oak trees, the dark shapes of them against the deep blue September sky. "I made my first dress before I married Thomas. Did I ever tell you the full story?" "Your cousin in San Marcos," he said. 4 nights in a row. 4 nights in a row. And when she put it on and cried, I thought, this is what my hands are for. But I didn't understand it fully. I understood the skill part, the making part, but not the pointing toward part." She paused. "Every dress points towards something, a life starting, a commitment being made, and I was spending all my time building toward other people's beginnings without—" She stopped. "Without building toward your own," he said. "Yes." She turned and looked at him in the evening light. "And then you asked me to." He looked back at her with that expression she had first seen in the church at Louisa's wedding, and had never stopped finding remarkable, unguarded, honest, entirely his and entirely hers. "You were always going to build it," he said. "I just asked at the right time." "Don't underestimate asking," she said. "Asking is not a small thing. Asking is how you build something you can't build alone." He reached across and took her hand, the same way he had at breakfast the morning she told him about William Thomas, the same way he had in the churchyard after the vows, the same way he had in the dress shop over the pattern spread on the table, his hand warm and rough and steady. She turned her hand and held his back. Mary Clara made a small sound in her basket and resettled without waking. The mockingbirds were going through their evening repertoire in the live oaks. Down the road, Millhaven was quiet in the blue September evening, the lamplights beginning to appear in windows, the smell of a dozen suppers in the air. "I want to make another dress," Rose said. He raised an eyebrow. "Which client?" "No client. I want to make something that isn't a commission, something for—" She thought about it. "I want to make a dress for Mary Clara for when she's older, something that will keep. The way Margaret Birch kept that silk for 20 years. She looked at her hands. "I want to make something and put it away and know it's there waiting." Orville was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What fabric?" "I have a piece of green silk I've been thinking about," she said. "Deep green, like the creek in summer. I got it last spring when that trader came through from San Antonio. I've been waiting to know what it was for. And now you know. And now I know." She squeezed his hand. It might be 20 years before she wears it, it might be something else entirely, but I'll make it and it will be there. He looked at her in the evening light with the particular quality of attention that was only ever for her. "You're already making things for the future," he said. "I always was," she said. "I just didn't always know whose future I was making them for." Mary Clara made another small sound, and this time Orville reached down with his free hand and rested it gently on her back, and she settled immediately, completely, the way children settle when they know the hands around them are sure. Rose leaned her head against Orville's shoulder, and he adjusted to make room for her, and they sat together on the porch of the house he had built and watched the stars begin to appear over the live oaks, one by one, precise and certain as stitches in silk, as nails driven true into good wood, as everything they had built between them. Carefully, honestly, at the time it required, and not a moment before it was ready, and not a moment after it was right. In the dress shop at the end of Millhaven's Main Street, the lamp was dark for the evening, and on the dressmaker's form in the corner, a half-finished garment waited in the quiet. Not a wedding dress, not a commission. A dress for a child who would one day be a woman, made from green silk the color of the creek in summer, built by hands that had spent 12 years learning what they were for, and had finally, fully, come home to the knowing of it. The season turned. The stars held their places above the Texas hills. The live oaks moved in the warm September air. And Rose Boone, held her husband's hand on the porch of her own good life, and let herself be, at last, entirely present in it.